Hi there, everybody. I'm Philip Eidson, and welcome to episode 305 of The Art of Procurement. Now, everyone wants to have a positive social impact on their community, but doing so, certainly in the context of the business world, also has to be a sound business decision. And, I think that's a problem that's restricted procurement's ability to really enable corporate social responsibility, or CSR, as a value lever. So how can you create opportunities for investment in social causes that are actually important to your company, that demonstrate an ROI of such an investment in those social causes, and that you're based off your relationships with your suppliers? So actually doing nothing more than what we're doing already. So it's an interesting question. And today I'm joined on the podcast by a social entrepreneur and the founder and CEO of Givewith, Paul Polizzotto. Now, Paul believes that he has the answer to those questions and a platform in Givewith to enable these investments in social causes. And he believes that for procurement leaders, CSR, as that value lever we talked about, is one that can finally be pulled. So let's go into this conversation. And I started by asking Paul if he could share a little bit more about his background in social entrepreneurship.
Well, my background in social entrepreneurship started 31 years ago. And the interesting thing was they didn't even call it social entrepreneurship.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know when that phrase was coined. I think back then all we wanted to do was start businesses that solved problems that we thought needed to be solved. My first project, my first business, my first enterprise was really quite personal, really as they all have been.
Mm-hmm.
But my journey as a social entrepreneur started quite personally. I grew up in Southern California. I grew up in a small beach community in Los Angeles called Manhattan Beach.
Yeah.
And
I know it well.
I grew up as a surfer.
It's a beautiful area of the world as well.
It certainly is. And so I grew up as a competitive surfer. I stayed amateur, but I was a competitive surfer, and I was involved in this very healthy sport. But in the 70s and in the 80s, Santa Monica Bay was quite polluted, and so we were involved in this very healthy sport, but we were sick all the time. And I was really curious, about what activities were happening in Southern California and Los Angeles that was contributing to the stormwater and urban runoff that was making us sick. And so I saw that contractors were cleaning industrial sites and manufacturing facilities, parking lots, even bioinfectious waste areas at hospitals, and they were washing all the pollutants into the storm drain system, which is ultimately goes to the bay because they're separate systems. Sewer and storm are separate in Los Angeles. And I was like, wait a minute. All that pollution is going into that storm drain directly into the bay. It's making us sick. And besides, that's against the law. That's illegal. That's a non-stormwater discharge. It's a violation of the Federal Clean Water Act. And I thought, well, if I could come up with a compliant way to do those types of activities and remove those pollutants and dispose of them compliantly, I could legitimize and legalize an industry. And so I pioneered something called urban watershed cleaning and a process called zero discharge. I won an award from the United States Environmental Protection Agency for the creation of the methods. And my first company set new standards. It was sort of like get legal or get out. And so all the big high-rise buildings and hospitals and all the big facilities in Los Angeles used my services to do their work compliantly. And all those pollutants that would have otherwise gone into the bay no longer were going into the bay. So it was immensely gratifying for me. But what happened was as that business began to grow, and I was immersed in communities throughout the United States, and I was being exposed to really worthwhile, meaningful projects where cities, counties, states, nonprofits have brought a lot of the money together for some really worthwhile projects, but not all the money. They need a little bit of gap financing to get fully funded and off the shelf and into the community. And so I was interested in starting a nonprofit. Here I had this successful environmental business, and I thought, well, I'll start a nonprofit because I want to win grants and I want to fill gaps. And so I started winning grants and I started filling gaps to get these really meaningful projects funded. And I realized very quickly that, wait a minute, I'm taking a grant out of an existing grant pie. This grant would have gone to another nonprofit had it not gone to me. And all I could justify was that grant was better with me than with someone else. And that was not something I was comfortable with. And what made matters worse was that my friends were the executive directors of those nonprofits.
Right.
And they said, Paul, we think what you're doing is super cool, but you're competing with us now. And that's when I started my next, social enterprise about 22 years ago, and essentially have been doing the same thing ever since. I've been leveraging B2B transactions as an agent for positive social change for the last 21, 22 years. So that was my first enterprise, and then I was off and running into my second.
So how do you leverage, a B2B transaction then for social good? I'd love to kind of understand a little bit more about the mechanics of how that's even possible.
Yeah. So B2B transactions, suppliers and buyers and what amounts to be the vast majority of our economy being made up of B2B transactions. But large suppliers and large buyers doing B2B transactions, suppliers have client acquisition budgets. They spend money on advertising and marketing and conferences and events, and they have all these different ways they go about trying to attract clients and incentivize clients to buy. And then they have a whole series of other things like discounts and free shipping and extended warranties and a whole series of things that they use to incentivize buyers to buy their product. And my thinking was, well, what if we used social impacts being offered by the supplier as a differentiator, as a sales incentive? Could a social impact provide a better return on investment than perhaps conferences or events or some forms of advertising and marketing? And my thinking around that was because there's shared value, and that the social impacts accomplish a bunch of other business objectives that normal sales incentives don't. So let me give you an example of sort of where it all began. My beginnings of leveraging B2B transactions started in the advertising industry about 21, 22 years ago, because it was becoming highly competitive and commoditized. And I thought, well, I think social impacts being offered by one advertising seller can help that advertising seller attract more new business, retain business, and provide more value to their customers. And so I entered into a joint venture with the CBS Corporation in 2008, 2009 to show that social impacts could help them win business. And this joint venture involved using the sale of a commodity, a 30-second ad unit, as an agent for positive social change. We underwrote a green schools initiative by going out and offering advertising buyers a new product that included social impacts along with the sale of the 30-second ad units. And it had us underwriting a green schools initiative that meant we were installing solar panels on schools, energy efficiency retrofits, planting organic gardens, teaching kids how to grow their own food and cook their own food. And we were attaching STEM education to the solar installations, and students were doing science projects around so they could see why do solar panels create more energy in May instead of December. And we were using the sale of a commodity, a B2B transaction, to fund solar panels on libraries, parks, and city halls. In fact, the City Hall of Miami became the first big city hall to be powered by renewable energy, and it was all underwritten by leveraging a B2B transaction. There were no taxpayer dollars whatsoever in that project. That joint venture with CBS won the 2009 Award of Excellence from the U.S. Conference of Mayors for being the number one public-private partnership in the nation. And CBS went on to purchase my company in 2010, EcoMedia. And we proceeded to use social impacts as a differentiator to win business away from our competitors. And we directed hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars of additional ad sales to CBS, and then directed more than $100 million in funding and resources to nonprofits, and positively impacted the lives of more than 60 million people. And so CBS saw the advantage of offering social impacts as a replacement for other kinds of incentives they were otherwise offering.
Okay.
And what that did is not only gave more value to CBS, because what did it do? Well, of course, it improved the quality of people's lives in the communities where they had media assets. And advertisers were able to leverage the money they were already spending on advertising. Not that they were spending more money in total on advertising, they were just spending more with CBS. And so CBS used social impacts to gain a larger share of the ad spend that was being spent against any platform or any community. And so it was social impacts became a differentiator.
Mm-hmm.
It became a sales incentive that helped them win more business.
So I'm trying to understand a little bit about the flow of the money. And you can tell me if this is kind of a wrong interpretation, but how I think I'm hearing it is, CBS is selling an ad unit, a 30-second advertisement on TV, and to help encourage people to buy that versus buying it on NBC or any other variety of ways that they could spend that money, rather than saying, and I'm just kind of making the numbers up, I'm going to incent you with a 1% discount on the price. Instead, they would say, I'm going to incent you because 1% of the price, I'm going to reinvest those funds into a social impact scheme that's important to your business, Mr. or Mrs. Buyer of those services.
Essentially, yeah. So maybe it wasn't, considered like 1% exactly. It was, I'm going to sell you this package of ad units, and along with this package of ad units that we've negotiated, I'm also going to add social impact.
Okay.
Now, it is true that our model today, now that, my third social enterprise, which is Givewith, which is a social impact technology platform that's leveraging B2B transactions across all industries. That is to say that what I saw was an opportunity. I was 7 years into CBS and said, hey, I don't think there's anything unique about an advertising seller or an advertising buyer. I think we can apply social impacts to everybody selling everything, everybody buying everything. We can create more value for suppliers and buyers across all industries. And we can use technology to do it with precision and at scale.
Right.
And that was the birth of Givewith. And Givewith is Givewith is a social impact technology company leveraging B2B transactions across all large industry sectors.
And so do you find then that clients or buyers and sellers who are using the Givewith platform, are the buyers requesting investment in social impact as one of the kind of prerequisites to do business with them? Or is it, on the other hand, on the other side of the equation, it's the seller who is saying, as well as all these things that I can offer you, I'm also going to invest, let's say, X amount of money in a social impact cause of your choice, on top of, all the other benefits that you get from buying from us?
Correct. Yeah. So the buyers are negotiating their best prices, the best price, the best terms, et cetera, all the other things that they're after. And then so they want to make absolute clear that the buyers are still negotiating the very, very best deals they can for their companies, and understandably so. But sellers can provide more value to those buyers by using other sales acquisition budgets, as I said earlier, advertising, marketing, and events and conferences and all the various things they do to attract business, that if they channel that through social impacts, their buyers aren't having to pay for it, but the buyers are getting more value. And so is the supplier. Because, boy, if you had to run the ROI on some of the things like advertising and events and conferences, it's tough to draw, direct lines, whereas with social impacts, it's quite clear that social impacts have a better return on investment for suppliers in the way of client acquisition funding than those other incentives. So let me give you an example. I'll give you a case study of a buyer seller. So in this case, a large media company wants to buy computers and printers, and they're on SAP Ariba. SAP Ariba is the largest B2B digital marketplace in the world, with roughly 4.4 million suppliers and buyers doing roughly $3 trillion in transactions. And so in this case, the buyer is on Ariba, and they put out an RFP, and they say, hey, we're looking for computers and printers, but we're looking for the responders to this, and it's built into the RFP the template. It says we're looking for the responders to this RFP to also consider underwriting a social impact that will create additional business value for both sides. So in this case, HP elected to use Givewith to respond to that request. And in this case, HP said, by using Givewith, we can help positively influence your ESG rating, environmental social governance rating. We can, by using Givewith as part of the sales transaction, help with employee retention, investor relations, corporate social responsibility, sustainability. And so the way it works is the company types in their name into our platform. We've done a deep dive on nearly 9,000 companies. Every company that has an ESG rating, environmental social governance rating, through MSCI, we know everything that company is doing in the way of sustainability, corporate social responsibility, philanthropy. We know all the nonprofits they're working with. We know all the awards they've won, all their initiatives. Then we pull their ESG rating from MSCI, True Value Labs, CSR Hub. Then we pull the standards that they're using against those rating agencies, or in terms of connecting with those rating agencies, from GRI, Global Reporting Initiative, SASB, which is Sustainable Accounting, to deem whether the project's social impacts that we're going to surface are financially material to the sellers and buyers. It's essentially a materiality assessment. And then we write a grant agreement to the nonprofit that has specific outcomes, outputs, and impacts that we verify, validate, measure, and report. And so we do all the reporting back to the rating agencies and standard setters in the companies. So in this case, as we ran all that information, it said, we think there's relevance in underwriting projects around diverse workforce development. And so it started to surface projects in the area of diverse workforce development, and the top algorithmic match from our platform identified a nonprofit called Black Girls Code, which teaches girls of color coding skills so they can fill the tech jobs of the future. And so in this case, the buyer says, okay, so I've negotiated the best price and best terms on the product, and on top of that, you're going to underwrite 500 girls of color to get coding skills in 13 U.S. markets. Now, every issuer and nonprofit and program in our platform, we have long-form videos. We have an award-winning content. We have the largest social impact nonprofit content library in the world. And so we have long-form videos that are like 3 minutes. We have 60 seconds, 30 seconds, 15-second videos, vast library of photography. We have pre-written press releases, newsletters, blog posts, investor relations decks that go to both the supplier and the buyer. So what we do is our platform, Givewith, carries out two main activities of match, measure, report. As I said earlier, the first thing that we do is we match issuers, nonprofits, and programs with suppliers and buyers that create the most amount of material business value. Carry out the grant agreement, where we verify, validate, measure, and report. And then the next match, measure, and report that we carry out is we take that content and we match it with a stakeholder group And we then send that content to employees and other stakeholders. But with employees, we say, so how does it make you feel? Your employer is underwriting coding skills for girls of color. And then we measure those responses on the part of the employees and report them back. And we do that across a series of stakeholders. And so we have a very precise way of identifying the types of social impacts that create the most amount of business value for both the supplier and the buyer.
So it's fascinating to me to kind of hear the process and the opportunity. And, when I put my procurement hat on, there's a couple of things I think of in terms of objections that I'm sure you hear all the time. So I'd love to hear kind of your perspective on these. And firstly, it's really from a procurement perspective. A procurement person may look at this and say, well, this is an incentive that is being redirected to a social impact, which is obviously, a good thing from a social impact perspective. But that might mean that I can save 1% less on this deal because, that incentive that may otherwise have been given me to lower my prices is now going somewhere else. And then kind of the second layer of that is for the stakeholder themselves, the CIO who is buying the laptops, they may look at it the same and say, I'm paying money out of my budget for these schemes. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm just saying that there obviously has to be a clear ROI.
Yeah, but that's like saying advertising's a scheme, marketing's a scheme, conferences and events are a scheme. That's like a buyer saying, give me part of your ad budget. Stop spending money on advertising and just reduce your price. You're like, yeah, I'm running a company here and I got to introduce my products and services to a broad world of buyers. So as much as I'd like to stop advertising and stop going to conferences and events and stop doing marketing and just radically slash my prices, that's part of how I tell the world about my business. So it needs to be understood that it's not as if this money could otherwise, or I guess it could, if you wanted to slash your advertising budgets and marketing budgets and events and conferences budgets, and just turn it over to your suppliers or your buyers. I suppose you could, but it would be tough to run a successful enterprise if that was your approach. So am I being clear there?
Yeah, I guess for sure, companies will continue to spend those budgets. So that's the only, when I think about a procurement person who's listening, they may think that I could negotiate an extra percentage point off the price because I'm incented by cost savings if that money isn't redirected somewhere else. And I'd say I'm not saying that where it's redirected is a bad thing.
Or marketing, or
well,
I suppose, I guess you could say, those other expenses that suppliers have in trying to acquire clients, like advertising, marketing, and the like. Yeah, I think the way I would say it is that a procurement executive really needs to negotiate their best price. Mm-hmm. And once they've negotiated their best price, they say, hey, there's just one other thing I'd like you to do. I'd like you to underwrite a social impact on my behalf.
Yeah.
And the reason why social impacts get a yes from the supplier is because it also benefits the supplier.
Right.
All other incentives are win-lose. Mm-hmm. So I might be a supplier that says, my margin is stuck. I can't give you any more price reduction, but I can give you Givewith, because when I give you Givewith, I actually get something back.
Yeah.
So I'm going to give you exponentially more business value from this transaction only because I'm getting something too. And that's why social impacts, because they're shared value.
Right.
All the other sales incentives are win-lose.
Yeah. And so measuring the value of that impact, you mentioned before about ESG ratings as an example. Is that the primary way that an organization measures its investment in social impact opportunities, or diversity, or corporate social responsibility, all those things? Are there a number of different measures that they would use? Because I'm thinking, how do you tie and how do we help procurement professionals and those that they're convincing about the value of doing something like this? How do we tie this to corporate objectives?
Yeah. Well, I think, first of all, it's quite early in the world of ESG, although it's becoming increasingly important now. Like every week, every month, it's amazing how the the focus on ESG has grown in the last couple of years. I wouldn't say that's the only way. I think corporations have had long-standing commitments to issue areas and to nonprofits, and they're quite proud of them.
Yeah.
What they have not done is precisely as our platform can do, is the types of materiality assessments around those issue areas and the overall business itself, from everything from ESG to employee retention and investor relations and these kinds of things. The other thing that our data pulls is custom Nielsen data and other employee data that tells us, what do your employees care about?
Yeah. And
how do we underwrite social impacts that align with them, so that you as a corporation, I think there's an experience gap between employer and employee. And I think there's a really important way for social impacts, tangible, measurable, authentic kinds of impacts, to close that experience gap between employer and employee. And so I think the more knowledge you have of the social impact interests of your employees, the more that you can underwrite initiatives that move the needle. I've been really fixated on the math. I've been involved in the world of social enterprise, social entrepreneurship, as I said earlier, 31 years. But we have a business relationship, a business arrangement, not just a consulting engagement, but rather a business relationship with the Boston Consulting Group. And we've been working with them for nearly 2 years. And one of the things that I asked them to do early on was to be quite precise about the math. I said, when the math is undeniable, our success is inevitable. And so we have to be quite precise. And so one of the things I asked them to do is I said, I want you to treat a corporation like it's a physical building. And I want you to look at that building, every office, every room, everything from sales to sourcing and procurement to HR, investor relations, marketing, government affairs, you name it. I want to know every single office in that building where social impacts can contribute additional business value. Then I want to understand every KPI in every room. And then I want to understand how Givewith social impact deliverables can move the needle on those KPIs. Not my KPIs, their KPIs. And I want to understand the monetary implications of the social impacts that Givewith carries out on those KPIs in those rooms. And that way we can then begin to understand how social impacts as part of the transaction are returning very precisely and very specifically business value to each one of those divisions of the company or rooms in the building. And so we've worked very, very diligently on making the math precise and making it undeniable. And so BCG has done everything from that type of initiative to very sophisticated conjoint analysis. And I was quite shocked because I think your question's fair about how procurement executives look at these types of incentives and wonder if there's not a way to, further discount things. But we did, BCG at the very beginning did some very sophisticated conjoint analysis. And what happened was this. It's funny. We started working with them, and it was right out of the gate. I said to them, social impacts are more valuable to suppliers and buyers doing B2B transactions and other sales incentives. And they said, we'll be the judge of that. And so they went out to more than 500 procurement executives across industries and did very sophisticated conjoint analysis where they bundled in different types of incentives into different deals. This one has free shipping, or this one has a volume discount, or this one has social impacts carried out through Givewith. They came back and they said, not only are social impacts more valuable to these sourcing and procurement executives, but they're seeing a dollar through Givewith as being 13 times more valuable than other types of incentives. And so Boston Consulting Group came back and said, here, I know something big here. And And that's what began what has been a 2-year journey with Boston Consulting Group, and ultimately has put us in business together on some projects.
Yeah.
So very exciting and very validating, enormously validating.
Yeah, and I think that's what has been missing for procurement for a long time. I think there's no argument among procurement executives, sourcing professionals that this is the right thing to do for an organization. But obviously there's the connect between being the right thing to do and it being the best business decision, and one that they can justify and validate, so as not to basically open themselves up to, are they doing the best thing for the organization? It's also interesting, when you think about procurement, we're on a bit of a, we've always had a struggle as a profession because our primary performance metric is cost savings, and a lot of organizations are trying to bring in more of a balanced scorecard to say, actually, we should look a lot more broadly about the impact that dealing with our suppliers, working with our suppliers, has in a variety of different ways, of which cost optimization is just one of them. And for some companies, cost optimization may be the most important, but for a lot of other companies, it isn't the most important. It's just one of many different things. So having data to say, hey, because the decisions that we're making, we're creating impact in other ways, I think is really important for procurement to help really expand the value proposition. And something we've struggled with.
I think cost optimization is absolutely crucial in all situations. But the question is, can you secure the best price, which I encourage buyers to do, and it's really important, and carry out social impacts that drive additional business value for your company. And this is where I think procurement executives are in a unique position today to elevate their position in the company, and have a cross-divisional impact on the company that perhaps they haven't had a chance to do before. That is to say that through sourcing and procurement and leveraging the purchasing power of the company, we can boost ESG ratings. We can boost employee retention. We can help improve investor relations, supplier relations. I mean, you probably saw not too many months ago the Business Roundtable, where 181 companies, signed, a statement saying that a corporation must look at a broader list of stakeholders. That, of course, shareholders will always be critical, but in addition to shareholders, the corporation really looking at a broader list of stakeholders and includes employees and communities and suppliers and vendors, and that procurement executives today, by applying things like Givewith, can start to address corporations as they start to look at a broad and I think sourcing and procurement executives uniquely, because they have their hands on the purse strings of the corporations, to be able to leverage those additional business value for their company. So I think this is an exciting time for sourcing and procurement executives to play a much broader and more valuable role within a corporation.
Yeah, the thing that also comes to my mind when we talked cost optimization and best price before is, for me, when we look at the products and services that we buy as an organization, as procurement, our outlook should be on the total commercial value of that product or service that's been bought, rather than the price alone. And what I mean is all the different impacts that has, in what we sell, in the customer experience, and how it impacts how we work as an organization, and ultimately the impact it has on all of our different stakeholders. And the more that you can measure that, the more you can actually make a case for investing more money in a particular product or a service, because it has additional benefits that aren't just captured when you're doing an apples to apples cost comparison. And that's really interesting to me as well.
Yeah, couldn't agree with you more. And it is up to us and our platform to be very clear, very specific, and very measurable in that analysis, so that there's no ambiguity.
Well, Paul, I want to thank you for your time today. I know it's about time to wrap up, so I just had a last question, and that's that if listeners are hearing this conversation, they're really intrigued as to what the opportunity may be, what would be the best way for them to find out a little bit more? What next step would you encourage them to take?
Well, we would love to hear from them, and they can reach us at givewith.com. And if they reach out to us, they can get on our website and make contact with us.
Mm-hmm.
And we would love to share with them how sourcing and procurement can be harnessed as an agent for positive social change, and that will help us take on the most pressing issues of our time, while at the same time respecting and understanding a sourcing and procurement executive's need to drive lower prices and generate greater value for their company. So we look forward to hearing from interested folks, and we look forward to unleashing the power of procurement in a very positive way.
Well, on that note, I'm going to I'm going to link to the Givewith website on our show notes page for today's episode. So listeners can go to artofprocurement.com/podcast. That's artofprocurement.com/podcast. And there's a list of all of our podcasts. You'll find the one here with Paul and talking about social impact and social entrepreneurship just on that podcast page. So go to the page itself for today's episode. You'll find the link. So I want to thank you one last time for joining me today, Paul.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Hi there, I want to thank you for tuning in to today's podcast. You can check out all of our back catalogue at artofprocurement.com/podcast, where you can also subscribe to our newsletter to make sure that you never miss an episode. And if you found value in today's show, I'd love if you would tell a peer, or perhaps go and rate and review by going to artofprocurement.com/review. Word of mouth really is the best way to help the podcast grow, and if you're able to do either one of those things, I would truly appreciate it.